Truth is, I thought it mattered. I thought that
money
mattered. But does it bollocks? Not compared to how people matter.
Welcome, mention and other fine folks, to the Sunday Dispatch of the Black Letter, where we contemplate thoughts worth thinking as we try to navigate through the upside-down, topsy-turvy world we find ourselves in, seeking greener pastures on the other side, hopefully coming out healthier, wealthier, and wiser. And in order to do that, we need to make sense of the nonsensical, of which there is much about. But today we're going to focus just on this one article about the potential next decade or so, I think. This is called The Fourth Turning, from a book of the same name, and Market Watch here has done an interview with one of the authors, so we'll spend some time on this. I think it offers perhaps some insight into the future, and so we'll take a look at this. It also echoes to a large degree what Ray Dalio has been talking about in many ways. So I think this decade is going to be one of much change and perhaps upheaval. Of course, that's something to be aware of. So let's get to it. The U.S. faces a potential secession crisis at home and open conflict with China in the coming decades, says author who predicted 2020 unrest. 2020s will bring creative destruction that pits boomers against millennials and challenges what it means to be an American. Neil Howe foresaw that 2020 would be a time of crisis for the U.S. back in the 1990s. Howe and his colleague, the late William Strauss, observed that every generation of Americans fits a particular archetype that influences the personality and practices of subsequent generations. Think of the GI generation, the greatest generation, who rose as one to victory in World War II and engineered America's post-war economic boom, the silent generation who never quite escaped from the GI's long shadow, the post-war wave of baby boomers and Gen X, who trumpet the me generation of individualism and self-determination, and collectivist-minded millennials born between 1982 and 2004, who came of age during two major economic recessions and ongoing financial insecurity, and who, with each passing year, hold the keys to the nation's future. Howe and Strauss concluded that every 70 to 80 years or so since the founding of the United States, this generational cycle reaches a tipping point. The crisis generation at such times, notably GIs and now millennials, ultimately sweep away many established norms and institutions and open the gates to social, economic, and political changes that carry the nation forward on a new path. Howe and Strauss called this phoenix-like era the fourth turning, and their influential 1997 book of the same title predicted that the U.S. would enter another fourth turning early in the 21st century. And here we are, of course. The fourth turning actually is here, Howe says. It began around 2009 after the great financial crisis. If Howe is correct, we ain't seen nothing yet. And this is where they start the actual interview. It's a good article. I encourage you to read it in its entirety if you're interested, but we'll tease out some of the highlights. The fourth turning is a generation-long era, so we expect it to last until around the year 2030. Typically, fourth turnings accelerate. Solutions are deferred, people start putting things off, and then people panic and insist that someone take charge. During the pandemic, young adults have been most in favor of a top-down national policy that insists on strict and universal enforcement of mask wearing and testing and tracing. And that's sort of part of what their ideology as a group is. It seems to be the one for sort of group involvement, community activism, and a strong top-down government. As for socialism, it's no longer a Bernie bro fantasy. Government this year has turned both workers and businesses into wards of the state, and we've seen that clearly. What really concerns millennials is whether liberal democracy can actually perform. Around the world today, confidence in democracy is rapidly declining in the generation now coming of age, which is a major reason why it is drawn to populists on both the right and the left. The way millennials see it, democracies are failing to invest in the future. While they brilliantly protect the rights and entitlements of all the people, they leave the next generation to fend for itself. And we've seen this happen. I think, of course, they're spot on there. And we are seeing this happen, especially in the wealth inequality that's happening, of course, thanks much to the Federal Reserve money printing. A rising share of Americans want one party to control all branches of government. And that is primarily in the millennial generation, Gen X and boomers. Generally have liked the idea of divided government because that means nothing much can get done. I'm on board with the millennials here. I think we do need a good government that is sort of steering the ship in the right direction. Fourth turnings tend to change the axis of political division, what it means to be a conservative and a liberal. In general, politics tends to turn economically and politically to the left and socially and culturally to the right, which is interesting. There will be more benefits, governments will be more involved in the economy, but more will be asked of citizens to participate, to serve, and to make sacrifices. Tied with bailing out kids for all of the debt they've accumulated, government is going to get much more heavily involved in higher education. Government will expand the supply, reduce the price, and both parties are on board with this. And of course, we do need that. There is a huge problem with debt currently in the world, and of course, the bifurcation of the society, the divisions among society, those the haves and the have-nots, that has to change as well. Stiff antitrust rulings against big tech are just around the corner. We're ultimately going to have a whole new government bureau, a digital regulatory arm, that's going to reinvent how we regulate communications. I certainly hope so, because it's well overdue that these big tech companies were brought to rather work for society rather than against it in some ways. There's an enormous generational swing in favor of antitrust, and not just in big tech, but in pharmaceuticals, banking, food, transportation, and other industries. Starting in the 1970s, we de-weaponized antitrust. Now we started re-weaponizing it. That's very encouraging, in my opinion. On any honest basis, if national health is the output of our healthcare system, this sector has shown negative productivity growth in recent decades. Republicans have not gone along with it, but there is an emerging national consensus that fundamental change is needed here. There are two classic approaches to antitrust: to break firms up or regulate them. You're going to find a generational divide on this question. For Generation X's, the solution is never trust the bureaucracy, never trust regulation, just break companies up. Millennials are not anti-business. Millennials would love to join a big employer and thereby join the middle class. And if there are substantial economies of scale, let big organizations reap them, so long as they play by the basic rules of the game. Millennials are not really into risk-taking entrepreneurship. For them, perma-temping is a curse, not a blessing. I think it's a curse for everyone, really. The biggest change generationally is going to be in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party now is bifurcated by age. They've got strong support among older liberals, the silent generation, and early wave boomers, particularly amongst its leadership in Congress, people in their 70s and 80s. Then you have all those millennials coming in at the young end. You see this twin-humped age distribution in the House of Representatives. The Republicans in the House, on the other hand, are mostly tightly packed in their 40s and 50s. Among voters, the most Republican-leaning birth cohorts are late-wave boomers and early-wave Gen Xers, aka Generation Jones, born in the late 50s and 60s. In fact, 61% of U.S. governors, congressmen, and senators born in the 1960s are or have been Republican. That's the most lopsided partisan tilt of any birthday kid now serving. As you move older than age 65, voters begin to tilt a bit back towards the Democrats. And of course, as you move younger than age 40, voters tilt very strongly towards the Democrats. What this means is that the Democratic Party is about to change very rapidly. The older Democratic leadership cadre is going to be disappearing quickly, and the center of gravity is going to lurch younger to these new ranks of blue zone millennials. They'll be able to give the Democratic Party a do-over from scratch. The Republican Party, with so many more committee chairmen in their late 40s and 50s, isn't going to change nearly as fast. And of course, if they don't change as fast, I'm not sure that they will do as well, politically speaking, but who knows. In our book, The Fourth Turning, we laid out 5 scenarios for things that could happen that would take us deeper into a fourth turning. One was a weapons of mass destruction attack on New York City by terrorists. Another was a super virus that causes quarantines and shutdowns. Another was Russia invading a former Soviet republic. Fourth was a debt crisis that threatens to shut down government. All of these have happened. The 5th scenario that we described, and hasn't happened yet, remember we wrote this book in 1977, is a secession crisis. I think that possibility is still on the table. If it does happen, it won't happen among the blue zone states. It would be a red zone movement, and there's something to watch for. 2 other possibilities to watch for. One is open conflict with China. Another possibility to watch for is inflation. My advice for investors: do not get stuck in long-term nominal assets. And I think what he's talking about here, primarily nominal assets, is probably bonds. Inflation would ease wealth inequality, and by hurting seniors and helping young workers, it would ease a similar imbalance by age. Today, households aged 75 plus have the highest net worth of any age bracket. That's completely without precedent in American history, and arguably needs to change. People tell me the fourth turning is a pessimistic or apocalyptic view. On the contrary, I'm hugely optimistic about America's long-term future. The fourth turning is an era in which we rejuvenate our civic institutions and our politics. And I think this also dovetails nicely with this whole idea of the Great Reset that's being bandied about by the IMF and other central bankers. I think we're going to see big changes this decade. And it's going to be difficult to manage, of course, through this process. But I think we'll come on the other end with a more equitable and more functional society and, of course, government. At least that's my hope, and I agree with how I think I am very optimistic about the future of Western democracies generally. But it could be a bumpy road these next 10 years. The most pessimistic future I can imagine is for the trends of the last 30 years to continue. America grinds on hopelessly, able to enact only inadequate patchwork reforms. So there you go, folks. A very interesting article, a long one, and of course I think a lot to chew and digest and to think about. I think there's a lot to say for it, and something I brings me some hope, even though of course change is always challenging. Okay, with that said, let's check on the markets. Wow, so this is another big day on the boards. As you can see, S&P 500 up over 1.4%, NASDAQ 100 up over 2.2%, Dow Jones 30 up over 1%, and Russell 2000 up over 0.5%. So looking really good and bullish. Of course, I think there's going to be a big correction at some point, but of course it's not happening right now. Might not happen until perhaps spring of next year. Who knows? Early next year, potentially. I think certainly towards the end of 2021 and into 2022 is when we'll see the low, potentially, of the stock market. And as Harry Dent has mentioned, I think that will follow the low, perhaps in 2023, of the housing real estate crash. So we might have up to maybe 6, 7, 8 months of still bullish movement here. But of course, I'm a bit of a nervous Nelly with the stock markets, considering that the real economy is so in such bad shape. But anyway, here you go. The stock market is doing well. Gold, much of the same for the past month or so. Still hanging around 1927, doing nothing much. I think if the dollar starts to gain in value and the stock market continues bullish in the next several months, we could see gold take a bit of a dive down to maybe 1800 or so, 1700, between 17 and 18. We'll see. And then, of course, I think it has a rally up to perhaps 25, 3,000 or beyond, potentially. Who knows? Obviously, silver, being a precious metal, does similar to gold, only it's more volatile. So it's hanging around the $24 level, $24.70, and I can see that heading down to perhaps 19, 18 or so. We'll see. Before it heads up to triple digits, I could foresee that happening within the next 5 years, but could be wrong too. There you have it. Okay, on to the cryptocurrency market. Well, cryptocurrency is making big moves here, 6% up in the last 24 hours, $428 billion market cap, 6,008 coins for your purchase and pleasure. Bitcoin dominance improving at 64.4%. Wow, look at these huge runs. Bitcoin up 7.9%, Ethereum 8.1%, Chainlink 8.8%, and Litecoin up 10.2%. So doing very well. So there you have it. I'm no longer interested in coins below the top 10. In fact, I'm really only sticking with Bitcoin at the moment, as most of you know who've been listening for a while. Bitcoin well above 14,000 now, heading towards, well, some folks are thinking 20,000 by the end of the year. There'll be a big bullish move. We have to pass, I think, what was it, 19,000, which was the last high. There might be a bit of resistance there. And then I think, of course, we easily start heading towards 20,000 and on towards 100,000 by the end of next year. That's at least my opinion. None of this is financial advice, of course. All right, on to the online oracle for today's most pressing question. So we're just speaking about Bitcoin, how it's doing well, to already up over 14,000, and some of us expecting it to be 20K by the time, by the end of the year. So I thought that'd make a good question for our trusty sidekick, the 8-ball economist. Will Bitcoin be worth 20K USD or more by the end of 2020? My sources say no. Interesting. Okay, so it means it's going to be worth less. So we'll see. I mean, it could end up being $19,999, and it would still be correct. Of course, I use the magic 8-ball just to remind me that even the human analysts on stocks and other things are practically useless, just as this magic 8-ball is. So I use it as fun and to remind me of the fact that one has to rely on one's own research, due diligence, and eyes. There you have it, folks. Thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate you. Hope you're having a great day. And I will soon probably get the results of the election, and then we can move on forward and focus on other things. So thanks so much for joining me. Hope everything is well. And remember, above all else, dum spiro, spero.